Thank you for taking the time to introduce yourselves. Allows me to get to know you a little bit better, and also get to know some of the things you might be able to share with us as we go through. So I'm not really sure if you've had prior workshops, if you've had the chance to really consider everything that is New Learn Alberta, reading through the curriculum, all of the things. I'm going on the assumption that you haven't necessarily gone through every last detail. I will, however, go on the assumption that you've seen the new structure of the new curriculum, because it applies to, no matter the subject area, applies to all of them. And so we're just gonna cover these few things today. That is, we'll consider a scope and sequence that could possibly work for us. We will consider the essential elements that we'll want to teach in grades 2 and 3. Now, I didn't take the time to look back at K and 1, but we can certainly talk about that, and I'll show you where we can look for those curricula as well. Exploring planning possibilities, so a long-range plan, a weekly plan, a theme or unit plan, and then moving on to sharing our resources. I'll share one or two things with you. We can talk about lessons and activities, and that's all if we have time. The goal of today's session is really to make sure that you feel comfortable covering what you need to cover, and no more, no less. That is to say, you've got a year to cover a curriculum, but we know all too well that you're not going to cover absolutely everything. And there's a reason for that. So let's look at all of that. Sometimes this section can go pretty quickly. It all depends on how much background you've got here. It is an overview of the rest of what we're going to be looking at. We'll delve deeper into each aspect in the coming slides and in the coming moments. I'd like to go over with you just the organizing ideas and learning outcomes for grades 2 and 3. And the reason I choose grades 2 and 3 is because in some schools we're starting in grade 2 and others we're starting in grade 3 when we teach ELAL. I'd also like to go over an overview of some major concepts. So I've got some documents that I'll share with you in a moment, and everything that I share with you today will be shared by email afterwards. So anybody who signed up for the workshop, whether you're here or not, you'll get the documents, the links, and all of that, including the slides to my presentation. So we want to go over the major concepts that will help dictate what it is we absolutely need to teach, the bare minimum essential elements. We'll also use the year at a glance model, so we have certain templates to use that will help us determine a logical order to all of the teaching, to take into consideration other factors, right? Things such as student needs, class dynamics, what I like to teach personally or include in my teaching. So I hope you don't forget that aspect, because you all brought in an important point at the beginning, and that is why you love to teach English. And so even mentioning, oh, I really love this theme or this book, and whether or not it's in the curriculum, I like to cover that with my class because it touches me on an emotional level. So don't forget that aspect. I think it's quite important, but there's always a way to find how it works with the curriculum. We'll also go over a concept sequencing chart, which is really a quick glance from kindergarten to grade 6 of the major concepts that are covered in each of the curricula going forward. So here we are. I'm going to, I think, just stop sharing my screen for a moment to be able to share with you some of those different aspects that I just spoke about, some of the different documents. All right, so here we go. I'm just going to pull up. I'm going to share my screen just for a moment, because this is the kind of thing you'll end up getting from me. So this is sort of my list of, these are the things I want to cover with you today, but the links that I'm going to end up using as well. So you'll get something that looks a little like this in your email. what it refers to, which slide in my planning. This is kind of rough, so you'll get something that's a little bit more polished. Don't you worry. All right, so I'm going to start off with New Learn Alberta. And if it's not too much to ask, can you let me know either by a show of hands or in the chat how many of you have signed up for New Learn Alberta already? Okay, as conseillère pédagogique and people who work at the district, that is what we do on a regular. Excellent, thank you. So it's important to do that for many reasons. The first of which, this is where they house the curriculum. It's lovely, and it's here, and it can be in print form, and it can be in digital form. I like paper, but I also like digital, depends on what I'm doing. So here's a little tour in case you haven't done it yet. So my login is pretty straightforward, pretty simple to log into my account, and I hope it lets me without two-factor authentication. Sometimes that's what it asks me for. I like to log in because only by logging in will you have access to boards. Now, are there boards that will interest you? Maybe yes, maybe no, but let me tell you, there are a lot of great resources that are there as well. So I'm going to the Curriculum Implementation Information Hub. You can go about this any way you like. But on the left of the screen, you can see all the little tabs that I can go and click. And that's what I'm going to do now, because here I'm going to find piloting, and we're looking at social studies right now. We don't need to go there. Let's look at the printable, the curriculum. So this is the online digital version. There is a printable curriculum here. I will also show you what I did to get to one particular document that I think you'll like. And we're dealing with English language arts, and you can select your grade level here. We're looking at grades 2 and 3. The beautiful thing about grades 2 and 3 is they're right side, they're side by side. So we can look at the organizing idea that flows through K to 6, the individual level guiding questions, and then learning outcomes, as well as the knowledge, understanding, skills, and procedures. We know them in French as CCHP and CUSPs in English. And from this point on, I'm going to go back to my document to be able to pull out the exact document that I created. See if I can, yeah, I can. So I took the curriculum from here, and here I am in grade 2. If I go to print, I can choose not to have the subject introduction, which is what I want. And I don't want all of this. I can just choose to print up organizing ideas. But if I also want the learning outcomes with it, I have to choose the guiding questions and the learning outcomes. And then I can choose which grades. In my case, this is what I did. Okay, so those are the steps. What I'd like to print. Oops. What I'd like to print, which components, so that is the organizing ideas, guiding questions, learning outcomes for the grades 2 and 3, and then it generates for me a PDF, okay? And because I've already done that, here it is. This is what it ends up looking like. And I like this capacity on New Learn Alberta because then I can just hone in on some bigger ideas. And when I'm looking at planning, I don't necessarily want to start with the knowledge, the understanding, the skills and procedures. I don't necessarily want to hone in on the details, but get a bigger picture. Okay, so this is something I was able to create, and that's how I created it. So we consider the learning out, the organizing ideas. And as you can see visually, I'm really visual, so this is helpful for me. Visually, right away, I don't have in grade 3 the organizing idea of phonological awareness. The assumption is that the students have covered it in grades 1, kindergarten grades 1 and 2. That is not always the case for our students, right? If they're starting in grade 3, we need to include that organizing idea. Okay, so that is the one first thing that occurs to me. And I've just taken this without adding in phonological awareness as the planning goes on, but I encourage you to consider going back different grades to check out what your students might be missing. And on first glance, after having spoken with them and listened to them in the first few days of school, you'll know right away what certain students will need to work on. And if they're starting to write in those grades, well, because they have in French already, well then, you'll know what to add on at that point. Okay, so those are the organizing ideas and learning outcomes. And I also like to know when I need to assess them. In general, any of these new curricula require us to assess and have an assessment by the end of the year, right? So there's nowhere that says that I have to cover everything in oral language for grade 2 by the end of my first term. Nowhere does it say that. And for me, that's kind of reminiscent of when I was teaching in Quebec and there was a new curriculum that, well, a new curriculum reform that rolled out when I was there like a million years ago. And their whole concept was cycles, right? So instead of grades 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's cycle 1. So there are 2 grades in cycle 1. The idea was to be able to attain all of the learning outcomes by the end of the cycle. Here we're still dealing in grade level, so year by year, but we're looking at really assessing and mastering by the end of a particular grade level. So let's take a look at what I've pulled together for grade 2. And here I'm only using the organizing ideas and the learning outcomes. And I pull it directly from that last document I showed you. It's a no-brainer. In working with teachers in the past, we talked a lot about where and when to touch on certain topics, certain big ideas, the organizing ideas, and when they might be assessed. And in some cases, and you'll notice that this is the case with writing, it may not be touched at all in the ELA classroom in grade 2. We may not really cover too much writing. One, there's no time, and we'll cover time in a little bit. There might not be time. They might not be ready. And certainly not at the beginning of the year. As you can well imagine, and as I'm hearing, a student who really only has concept of consonants at the beginning of the year, we might not want to dive into the deep end of the pool. But here, the term assessed, so assuming I've got 2 terms, because I know that's the case at Franco-Sud, I don't know that that's necessarily the case in the 3 other conseils scolaires in Alberta, Francophone. So if you're dealing with 2 terms, this is helpful. But if you're dealing in 3 terms, it's not a huge leap to think, okay, I can cover this in term 1, I can cover this in term 2, and then by the end of term 3, I will have had to cover it all, assess it all. So when you see term 2 in part, it means there are going to be some aspects that I'm not covering at all, that I'm not going to see with my students. And so I'm assessing part of the curriculum by the end of the year. So I've grayed out mostly text forms and structures, conventions, and almost completely writing. Okay, the colors are adjusted for that reason. And like I said, the terms are right there. Let's check out grade 3. And by the way, don't hesitate to stop me. I can talk and talk and talk. Not that I like the sound of my own voice, just I like to make sure I'm sharing with you all the vital information I think you're going to need. So it's not too different in grade 3, and that's what I like about this particular workshop, is covering grades 2 and 3 is pretty straightforward and fairly similar. And so again, I've added in the writing here to be covered and assessed in part by the end of the second term. And nothing else is in part. As you can see, it's fully assessed by the end of term. And by fully assessed, I'm going to show you what I mean in the year at a glance documents that I have for you. All right, so here they are, year at a glance. Again, I'm a visual person. The reason I created it this way is so that for me, I could see at a glance what I might need to cover. Now, in working with groups of teachers, this is what we came to as a conclusion. However, this is not prescriptive. This is not what I'm telling you to do. This is just the result of many conversations. And the fact that I've taught English for many years, and the teachers I worked with have also taught English for many years, and they've had the experiences to be able to say, you know what, I'm not going to assess that in the first term. I'm only going to assess it in the second term. That's good enough for me. And in fact, maybe, I'll give you an example, maybe I won't even be able to get to that at all. So here's an example. In the first term, I'm not going to touch poetry. That's not something that my students are going to be ready for. So I'll touch on it at the end of the year. Am I going to assess it? Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe I'll assess certain skills and procedures or certain bits of knowledge, not forgetting that your knowledge is what your students are supposed to know, and skills and procedures, what your students are supposed to be able to do. All right, so I'm going to go through this quickly, like I said. You will all have access to these documents to study on your own to see if they fit with your values and what you end up teaching. You'll notice as well that in oral language, it is all highlighted. And in having worked in different schools, and one in particular, I remember thinking and sort of not laying down the law, but thinking, okay, we don't have the same time as they do in English schools. We have to cover whatever we can cover this year. So let's prioritize. We'll talk about priorities in a little bit, but oral language, I think you might agree, oral language would be my first priority. Writing will probably be my last. We'll get to that. So everything is highlighted here. I'm going to assess it all through the year. I'm going quickly, so I hope you don't get too nauseous. Many cusps here, so it's all highlighted in yellow. Vocabulary is one that can be debated. So in this case, going through vocabulary, not a lot of emphasis was put on it at the beginning of the year and some towards the end of the year. Vocabulary is in development, right? And in grades 2 and 3, as they're learning at least 2 languages, confounding certain words, misunderstanding, building on the vocabulary, we're working really hard in French because students in general are not hearing it too much outside of school. And they're definitely not hearing it in their communities. In a milieu minoritaire, English is usually everywhere. It may not be at home. There might be a third, fourth language that's happening there. And so going easy on vocabulary may be beneficial. And in fact, trying to cover it more in grades 3, 4, 5, 6 may be helpful as the student's level of development is catching up. We'll talk also about transferable skills from learning French. Morphemes and morphology in general, I will say this, I find it super interesting. So on a level of personal interest, it would be something I would want to include. I like it for very many reasons. It can be played with. There are many lessons and activities, and the amount of resources that exist for morphology is very wow. And so I would make use of that. I can see how that would be helpful, especially as you're building language. And I'm going to refer directly to adding suffixes such as ing and ed to the ending of a base. And why do I say those particular? Well, when we're conjugating our verbs, and I know this from my own personal experience, those particular endings are important to get early on. You might not want to wait too long adding certain endings to words or certain prefixes. That's morphology. Phonological awareness, again, all yellow here. Our students may not be hearing, well, they're not hearing it in any of their other classes necessarily. So this is going to be something that is very base that will have to be worked on. And I would even hang on to this moving into grade 3. So not losing that grade 2 curriculum moving forward, or if you're starting in grade 3, going back and checking this out. Blending, consonant blends, really getting a handle on what the sounds are supposed to be. And so that when our students are listening, they're getting the full message. When our students begin to speak, they're starting off on the right foot and not having to correct themselves later on. And from there, we move on to phonics. Now, phonics and morphology in general are a lot of fun, and like I said, can be well used in activities. And so it may not be covered too much in the first term, but by the second term, we're going to need to focus a little bit more and maybe assess. Fluency, again, there's not a lot of emphasis necessarily in this first year of learning fluency, because again, a skill and procedure, for example, is reading 175 new high frequency words automatically. That might be a really high bar to hit. But using pace, phrasing, and expression, that's something that can be developed. Do we want to assess it? Maybe not, but let's introduce our students to it. So anything that's highlighted in green, light green, is something that, we'll cover in class, we'll play with, we'll work with, but I might not assess my students at this point in time. And then I'll move on to comprehension. And again, it all builds like any other language, one on top of another. So here we're talking about reading comprehension, but it's more than just text comprehension, right? Am I understanding what I'm hearing as well? So discussions and visual representations form a part of our comprehension. So let's not get too caught up in reading comprehension. So that's why it's highlighted in green and not highlighted at all. And again, part of it, we won't even touch. I'm going to move directly onto, I think it's writing that's coming right after this. There's a lot of comprehension in there, and you can see it's not all highlighted. Yeah, writing, nothing is highlighted in grade 2. And so as a teacher, yeah, I'm gonna maybe want to touch on some of these aspects of writing. My students are already writing in French, so they have the capacity physically to write for the most part. So play with this. This is yours to play with. And lastly is conventions, right? So, transference, are they capitalizing? Are they putting a period? Those types of conventions in grammar can be very interesting. And maybe I'll just highlight and assess a few things from this list, as it were. I might not touch adverbs at all. Subjects and verbs agreeing in sentences, I might not be there. Okay, so these are just things that I'll be looking at, but maybe not assessing. And that brings me to the end of grade 2. And as you can see, grade 3 looks pretty much the same. I don't want to waste any time here, but I do want to go over this quickly. So you'll notice the difference between the 3 colors. And anything in orange is something that I would say, absolutely should be covered and then assessed following. When it's, yep, go ahead.
The question. Since we're not in Francophone on our report cards, we're not assessing their writing and their writing skills, and so it's just l'oral and l'écoute in grade 2. Is there a list somewhere of what Francophone wants us to for sure cover out of this? Because you can't cover everything, and the Alberta curriculum gives us like everything, and they're just starting in grade 2. So it's like, did we just do our best and get them as far as we can in the grade 2 curriculum, or is there something specific that's out there that we're supposed to cover to finally catch them up later, but
It's
I don't
an
know.
excellent question because you want to make sure you're doing it according to how your boss says you should be doing it. And
Right.
I totally get that. Now Isabelle is here and she can confirm or not my answer, but I would say that Franco Sud has nothing that says you must cover this and you must not cover that. That's why we're providing the workshop so that it gives you the possibility and empowers you to be able to make those decisions in a logical way and amongst your peers, your colleagues, so that you can cover the most that you can in, again, the most logical way, right? What makes sense? And let me go back to my presentation because I think we'll start to maybe not answer completely that question, but we'll give you a better sense of your responsibility in all of this. Isabelle?
But you're right. There's no document from Francosud that says this is what you need to assess by the end of grade 2.
Yep. So I don't want you to feel like you're on your own with that, but I don't want you to feel either that you're tied to absolutely having to cover the whole curriculum because you're not. The expectation is that you won't be able to cover the whole curriculum. That is the expectation. So
Yeah, and then like one group kind of I could go a little further. I did still go into some of the stuff because once they were ready at the end of the year, like some of the reading, some of the because
yeah,
they were ready. But then I'm like, the more ready they are for grade 3, I think the better. So that's okay.
100%,
Okay.
100%. And like I mentioned earlier, there are going to be some class dynamics where, oh my God, it is pinib. I cannot get through this. And there are going to be other cohorts that you're like, oh my God, we're covering like it all. We're so good. You know, there are years like that, right? There are cohorts like that. And that's completely normal and natural. So,
Okay. So
And
I looked and I didn't find it because it doesn't exist. Okay.
no, and then Monique with the new report card where you'll be able to select what you evaluated. That's how the parent will know what was seen in the classroom because you will be able to choose all the outcomes that you were able to assess.
Okay.
I think that's the best way to tell the parents what was seen is, and we'll present that pretty soon in a couple weeks here. But yeah, if you did assess oral, then you select it, and then you can have your mark for that student. But if you didn't touch it, then you don't put it in the report card. So only the things that were assessed are gonna show up.
Okay.
mhm.
I'm looking forward to the improvements.
Yeah. And you know, and that's how we should look at it too. Sometimes we're faced with a new curriculum and we think, ugh, is it really going to be an improvement? Honestly, I think it's an improvement for many reasons. And one of those reasons is the structure and the clarity. So that's two reasons, structure and clarity. They allow us to plan better and to know exactly what we should be seeing. But then again, you know, it's not going to be the same for us. That's why we have a workshop dedicated just to teachers in Francophone schools, because all of my colleagues who are designers of professional learning have covered this across the province, but not like this. And so this is especially for you. So I'm going to go through some more documents in terms of the scope and sequence. It is a big chunk. But then I'd like us to have a quick little discussion and then move on to that long range planning template. So just some things that I can give to you that will help you to plan in the way that makes the most sense for you and your kiddos. So here's a scope and sequence document, and it is for grades 1 to 6. I took bits and pieces from different school districts, but for me, it's mostly a template. Okay, so there's a little blah blah before you begin, some of the background behind scope and sequence, English language arts and literature, um, what uh, what this is all about, what the goal of this is. So here would be grade 1, and I'm just going to them right to, and if I can make this a bit bigger, grades 2 and 3. So here I have it separated into 3 terms. It was the gabarit was the template that I had to work with. It can also be adjusted for terms 1 and 2 only if there are only 2 terms in your district. And so the organizing ideas are laid out right here. I believe there are, what is there, 7 of them? How many? 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Sorry, 9 and then 8 in grade 3. So it is laid out so that we see month by month, term by term, what would be covered. So for example, I could cover text forms and structures all year long. Oral tradition can be covered all year long. Listening and speaking, I may only get 2/3, need to do that for 2/3 of the way, and then move on to verbal and nonverbal communication. So I'm just sort of taking the learning outcomes in this part. Right, so organizing ideas off to the left, those are just learning outcomes. Again, this is not detailed, and it's meant so that you can then work into your planning month by month, theme by theme, using the details, which are the cusps. Okay, so here for vocabulary, part of it is covered again. And I didn't work too long on this. I just sort of put it together so it can be used as a template. All right, and so there are writing processes that are here, but it could all be blacked out as far as you're concerned. Okay, like I said, it will depend on your reality, your context. And here's the grade 3. Okay, it's not complete because it's a template. So that's scope and sequence. And I also found this great document on APLC, and that is if you haven't gone to the APLC, so it is simply aplc.ca. It will be one of the links that I share with you. There are so many resources for ELAL and EAL, mostly K-6 because that's what we've worked on the last couple of years. But wow. So when I take elements of text forms and structures, we could be talking about fiction, the different elements in fiction, nonfiction structures, narrative structures. But then it also goes on to just figurative language, dramatic works, text, land as text, oral tradition, right? So that all falls into the oral language category. And so you could really only just focus on those lines where it's oral language and use this to help you see what the progression is from K-6. And that's what I really like about this particular document, is that I can see from K-6 what the progressions would be. So if I'm teaching grades 2 or 3, I want to know what they should have already learned, but we didn't offer it in our school. I want to know where they'll be going. And if you are the English specialist teacher in your school, well, then you're probably covering all the grades K-6, or in this case, 2 or 3 to 6. But if you're the English teacher for your class, but also the titulaire, well, you'd like to know what they're going to have to see and cover next year as well. And as the years progress in grades 4, 5, and 6, the more time they have devoted to ELAL. Let's talk about time a little bit. Yeah, let's go there. Okay, so I know that, and here we go. I'm going to try and share this with you. There we go, the essential elements, right? We get to choose what we teach our students during the year, and considering the time allotment for ELAL specifically in a Francophone school, we want to also think about the skills that will be transferred from FLPL and reflect on what's taught in subsequent years. So I prepared a little Mentimeter, but we won't have to do this. I just want you to think and want us to talk about what the priorities are. So if you see, I have a list, and it's not in order. It's meant to be played with today. Text forms and structures, oral language, vocabulary, phonological awareness, which is only in grade 2, or only up to and including grade 2, phonics, fluency, comprehension, writing conventions. It's how it's all listed out in the curriculum. But I'd like to hear from you. What would be your top 3? What are your priorities, or top 3, you can give me 5. I know I wrote down my own, so I'd like to see what you might think would be a priority for you in your classroom with your kids. Maybe I'll leave this on the screen, but by all means.
Well, oral language is the base, right? And through that, you'll learn vocabulary, you can work comprehension. Yeah, you can practice a lot of these elements first, just orally.
Yep. And you're right. And that overlap is another beautiful thing about the curriculum, is that as you're working on oral language, you could also be working on fluency, and you could also be working on vocabulary, like 3 things at once. Right? So it's a great priority, oral language. Any other ideas? That's how I laid it out for our English teachers. I said, as long as we're talking about listening and speaking first, that would be the priority in my classroom. And we had it laid out as listening, speaking, reading, and writing, right? So listening and speaking, they absolutely had to cover. And I think at the time there was grade 1. Yep, and there was English in grade 1 as well. So the grades 1, 2, 3 teachers only focused on oral language. But included in that is the phonological awareness, the vocabulary, and like you said, the fluency in terms of speaking. Other priorities, again, in there, phonological awareness. I might not put phonics before vocabulary. I might, it depends on my cohort. It depends on what interests them. Fluency, if I'm talking about fluency in terms of reading, I'm not prioritizing that right away. But, tell me what you think.
I find generally by grade 3, except for my students that are new to Canada, usually, or new to Alberta, they have a significant oral vocabulary. They can yak up a storm, but they can't read or write anything. So, as soon as I say we're doing English class, it's like blah, 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 they won't stop talking, except for the new ones. But when it goes to put to like reading something, they kind of freak out, or, write me even a sentence so for me, I don't know. I know oral vocabulary has to come first, but my students in grade 3 tend to have a lot of oral vocabulary, but very little knowledge of how the English language, like what are the sounds of the letters, how is the same, how is it different, that kind of thing. So I don't know, that would be sort of a priority for me, because if they want to learn to read and write a little bit in English, like that's something they're kind of motivated by, but you need to start with the basics because they can't do it otherwise.
Yep. And I love that, Leah. You're absolutely right. So for you, and it would be true, right? Our kids they're hearing it everywhere. They're speaking it all the time. They've got a good basis. I feel pretty secure in that aspect in listening and speaking. So yeah, maybe I'll gear myself more towards the phonics and the morphology, so that giving them a base for their reading and, looking into the science of reading and all of that could be really interesting. Like you said, if they're motivated, you want to use that to propel them forward and give them the tools they need to succeed in grades 4, 5, and 6. Thank you. Monique?
The phonological awareness and the phonics was one element that I used the secret stories with them, and I'm curious how it's going to go in grade 3 this year. I'm going to see what the feedback will be to see if it's transferred through to the reading and to the writing. So we didn't do a lot of the reading and writing, but we still did some of it. I'm curious if, since all the grade 2s should have done it, if it'll transfer through.
Yeah. And it's always interesting to be able to access that kind of data, that information as they move up. did my pedagogical methods work? Did my choice of what I was teaching them, did that work for them moving forward? So that's why I say it's important to check with the following teachers. What are they going to be covering? What should my students know before they hit grade 4, 5, and 6? That kind of thing. And talking to the teachers before, if that's not you personally, what did you cover with them? So, okay, so this basis has been done with you. I feel comfortable tackling something else. And that's the beauty of collaboration, right? If you've got the chance to be able to sit and talk with your colleagues and get a sense of what you're going to have to do, well, doesn't that make your job easier? Vocabulary, oral language, and phonics in first. Yeah, it can all be embedded. Thank you, Katrina. That is absolutely true. Love it. Thanks for your input. It's always very valuable. I'm gonna go on to my next question to you because I don't necessarily have the answer to this, but can you tell me, take a guess, how much time is allotted to ELAL in your grades in your school or district? Could vary from school to school. So it's been a while since I made the calculation, but I did do the calculation, and that is relative to either FLPL or what they're learning in English schools.
And if you have a Catholic school too.
That's right. That's why it varies from school to school. When I last calculated, comparing it to FLPL in these grades, it was a third of the time. And that's not counting all their other subjects that are in French. Where in English schools, when I participate in workshops and I talk with my colleagues who are also consultants, they're constantly talking about multidisciplinary projects and activities and planning, and what we're covering in social studies can easily have our ELAL components transferred over. Well, it's just not our reality. And that's important. And that's why the following 2 workshops I'm giving are going to help in this domain as well. So at Mosaic, is it? Yeah, La Mosaic, it's 15% of their schedule. Yeah, less in grade 2 than I have allotted for grades 3 to 5. That's for sure. So the older they get, the more time they have allotted to them. And that is usually the way it goes. So by the time they hit, is it grade 6 where they have the same number of minutes for ELAL in a Francophone school as they do in an Anglophone school. So sometimes we're hitting that at grade 4, sometimes grade 5, sometimes, but they have to get there by grade 6. The reason they have to get there by grade 6 is because they have the same PAT as the English schools. And man, am I proud of my students when they perform on their PATs at least as well, if not better than their colleagues in English schools. It's like, wow. So what went well there? Well, there are a lot of things that could have gone well. Transfer of skills. That's another thing I'd like to ask you. What skills do you think they're transferring over from their first language learning? Because it's not always
The sounds.
their
We'll
sound.
start with the sounds. We think sounds in French and English are very different, but they're almost all the same. I think there's 2 that's different.
Mm-hmm.
So once they learn the conscience phonologique, it's very transferable to English because they're almost all the same sound.
Yep, it's pretty much the same alphabet, right? I've learned 2 other languages besides French and English, and I can say that that is definitely a transferable skill. Yeah. The Hebrew alphabet is not the same as the English and French alphabet. Makes it really hard to learn. Arabic is very difficult as well. But, so, sounds. What else? There's a lot.
Reading strategies.
Reading strategies. The strategies themselves are the same. It's beautiful. Thank goodness. That's why they can perform so well by the end of their elementary grades. Because
Yeah.
they've been learning 2 languages this whole time and mastering them. And the strategies are often, if not the same, pretty similar. Holding a pen or pencil. It sounds silly, but they learned that in kindergarten and developed it more in grade 1. So that physical activity is a transferable skill.
Organizing a text.
Yep.
An introduction, it's the same,
Yeah.
different words, but it's the same structure.
Same structures, text forms and structures. So I haven't studied in depth the FLPL. That's next on my agenda. Margot, I promised, but she's left already. So there are things that are going to be different from the ELAL curriculum to the FLPL curriculum. But even though there are differences and essential differences to the language in and of itself, there are plenty of skills that are transferable. So I want you to keep that in mind, keep those conversations open with your colleagues who are teaching FLPL. Take a look at the curriculum for FLPL. I think that's very helpful as well. Okay. Thank you for all your input. And I'm gonna go back to my presentation, share with you the last little bits here. When I prepared this presentation, I thought, plenty of time. It's like almost too much time that I have. Nope. Nope, not true. Okay, so we covered the essential elements. We really did. In planning. So in knowing now what I absolutely should cover, nobody's dictating it to me, but I know my students, I know where they're coming from, I know their surroundings. So now I can plan. And then the structure of this new curriculum allows us to consider big concepts at a time before planning for the details. We can start to slot those into a monthly plan and then a weekly plan, and then incorporate units and themes. When I was teaching, it was grades last, the ELA, it was grades 7, 8, and 9. And I have particular themes that are really, really close to my heart. I love social activism. And so I'm able to incorporate in my teaching, regardless of curriculum, a theme that really touches me. And if it touches me, if I'm passionate about it, well, I can translate that to my students. Let me just see what else I wanted to share with you here in my document. Okay, so yeah, long range planning template that I will share with you is a Google Sheet that was shared with me, can be found on the APLC website. So although I'll be sharing it with you, it will also be available to you in different ways. Organized by focus area. So that's the first onglet, the first tab, but then each one is divided up into organizing idea. So I don't know if you can see at the bottom there. Can you see? Yeah, I think. Yeah. Phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary fluency, and on. And it's just a blank slate, but the headings at the top really help. So if I'm going by week, I'm looking at a date range, I'm considering the outcome or understanding, and one family is coming home. So that's the learning outcome or the understanding. Am I going to do whole class instruction, small group instruction? I'm probably going to do both, maybe not for everything, but how is that going to look? What resources do I need? What is the theme for that week or that particular unit? The assessments, and notes for next time. So I love this little template. It's very, very handy. And when I share it with you, you'll be able to make copies for yourself. And then as I go through these slides, these are some ideas and some resources I'll share with you. So I'll share with you the link to the New Learn Alberta site. I'll share with you the APLC site. And there's a particular site that I've been looking into a lot recently, and it helps me to put together my workshop on routines and differentiation. So they've got a lot of really good ideas just on this site in and of itself. So Reading Rockets, if you haven't checked it out yet, let me cover that in a second. Yeah, here we go. So the New Learn Alberta site, we went through and I showed that to you. That was here. Again, printable curriculum. I can, from this point, also print up whatever I'd like. I could explore different resources and resource collections. And one of the my absolute favorite aspects are the boards. So I'm going to choose all boards just to give you a sense of how many there are right now. So 245 across the board for the whole province in French and English, covering many different subject matters. And some of these boards are created to be very multidisciplinary, which is interesting, but some of them come with added resources in them as well. Weaving Indigenous ways of knowing into the curriculum. By the way, I do have, and it's here, if you're looking at incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into the new curriculum, there's a great YouTube video put together by my colleague Tammy Johnston. She's fantastic. And so she covers a bit of that. But there's also a new site. Oh, I'm going to have to write that down. There's a brand new site that you will love. It is only in English. However, the ideas are inspirational, and that's incorporating or integrating Indigenous ways of knowing and being, particularly from a Cree Métis standpoint. So I think you'll appreciate that. The Reading Rockets site right here covers everything. It really is wonderful. And like I said, I'm using it for routines and I'm using it for differentiation. So when we talk about whole group instruction and small group instruction, I'll be covering that very shortly in the upcoming workshops, but this is where I get some really great ideas. Okay. I'll also link in, well, I'll link in for the next workshops, the other resources that I use. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that covers my portion of the presentation. I leave it up to you to share with me your thoughts at this point in time. Is there anything you'd like to see covered in a future workshop that I haven't already mentioned to you? Because as I said, we've got routines for the ELAL classroom, K to 6, or more likely 2, 3 to 6, and differentiation in that classroom. But I'm all ears to hear what you have to say. Thank you, Nicole. Like, are there any needs that you feel you have? Liette, you mentioned that your students are well versed in oral language. They speak it, they understand it. They've got a wealth of maybe even vocabulary. So maybe your focus is on something else you might need a little extra boost with. Let me know.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, thanks, Barbara. I have to think about it. I find I get really overwhelmed when I look at the English curriculum. There is like, if you look at it, basically you could just do that full time. Like, and then it's just like, I appreciate you saying these things are essential. I have to go and look at that more in detail because basically every time I look at it, I kind of have a little freak out because we only have a certain number of hours per week. And then with the huge math curriculum, the huge science curriculum, the huge French curriculum, it's just like, oh my God, we're never going to cover like a quarter of this. So I appreciate that. So I'm going to take a look at that. And Marie-Claire and I, we planned together. And last year we sat and looked at, okay, we're doing poésie, we're doing poems, really going to focus on that in French. Skip that in English. We're going to do something like les récits. What traditional teachings, we're going to do that in English. We have to skip it in French because sometimes we were doing exactly the same thing. And the kids were like, Madame, we already did this. Like we did it in French, but to them, they understand that it's the same thing, like text forms and stuff like that. So we just that's the only way realistically, unless we, do school year round, there's no way to get through it. So that's kind of one of the strategies that we've sort of done. If I spend a lot of time looking at what are, I can't think of the word in English, but what myths in English, and we didn't spend a lot of time looking at that in French. We maybe would just mention it. It's that kind of thing. That's I don't know. I just find I'm overwhelmed. That's kind of my short version.
Well, you know what? And you're not the only one who's overwhelmed. It's all I hear. It's very understandable, but what a great strategy. Two strategies you've got going for you, right? The collaborative planning that you do. Every time I've seen collaborative planning, it works out in the student's interest 100% of the time. And also considering what they're covering in French doesn't have to be covered in English if it's already been covered. Like, why? Why would I double my work? Why? I hate that. It's not like, and when I talk about translation, because we talk a lot about translation in my work, I hate the idea of doing something in English and then just doubling it in French. Like to me, it makes no sense. It doubles my work. And our students are constantly thinking in these two languages. We think in the two languages. So why am I going to double up my work? Why are the students going to double up their work? They've seen it. They've covered it. I want to take away some of the feeling of overwhelm that you have by saying you don't have to cover the whole curriculum in the year. You really don't. You don't even have to follow the scope and sequence that I'm laying out. You don't have to do any of that. If you're covering poetry in English, maybe not cover it in French, right? Like you said, you're going to have things to pick and choose. And if you're teaching all of the things to your students, you have a lot of power to be able to pick and choose. And if you are the English specialist in your school, you also have the power to pick and choose because you're going to see those students all the way through their English learning. So, but digest this a little bit and come back to me if you'd like with, you know what, this would be really helpful. And either I have access to a resource that can help you, or I can then go back and create a workshop that will help a lot of teachers. So I'm all for you telling me what you need. That's what I want to hear. And like I said, I follow up all my workshops with an email that details what we covered. You'll get the recording, you'll get my presentation slides, and you'll get the links that you saw with me today. If there's anything else that you need, you'll have my email address. You can contact me at any time, and it is more than my pleasure to be able to cover some topics with you.